Hi again. Here we are to continue our discussion of view controllers and the page view controller with Xcode 7. And, in the last video, I made an example that showed a child view controller in the current view. And the page view controller does exactly this for us, but it manages a group of views and it allows you to swipe between them. So rather than just showing one, it will allow us to swipe left and right to show the next view or the previous view, okay? And it does what we're doing here in the background, right, with a little bit of animation and a transition and whatnot, right? So let's set up our page view controller. And you can set the page view controller up in a few ways. I'm going to do it this way. I'm actually going to make a page view controller here in Storyboard, okay? And, you can set it up in a lot of different ways. I'm using the storyboard method because I use storyboard for the other stuff, and it will allow you to set a lot of the options here in the property inspector, okay? So where's the page view controller? Well, over here on the list of objects in the object palette, the page view controller is this one, right? It's got the little dots at the bottom. So it says page view controller, right? So I'll drag this and, I'll place it here. And I'll use the properties to set the size. Okay, so now it's a size there. So essentially, what we're going to do this time that will be a little bit different is instead of adding page 1 as a child view, we're going to add page view controller as a child view. And then the page view controller, we're going to tell it to load up these pages here, right, to display. Okay? So here's our page view controller. Let's click on it and then make sure it's got the blue outline, and then I'll go to the identity inspector, and in the identity here, let's set the storyboard ID. So I'm going to say, I'm not going to call it page view controller because that's a little too close to the original name. Why don't I just call it my page view controller, just to make sure we know that this is different from everything else, right? So I'll call that my page view controller. And then I'll check the box here for restoration ID. In this case, it doesn't matter. These guys need the restoration ID. We're going to use that. This guy, we're not going to use it, but I'll just do this one to keep it consistent, right? So there we are. And now let's get this one to show up here. So I'll switch to View Controller. And right now, we're loading up Page 1 View Controller. And so what I would like to do here is I would like to load up my page view controller, okay, because that's the the name of our page view controller, right? So that's going to be view controller here, and then we can call, add child view controller and self view, add sub view, and view controller dot view. But now we need to set up the page view controller so it can work for us, right? Because now instead of just being sort of a static view, it's got kind of an active thing, right, where it's going to load different views and allow you to swipe left and right. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to make a variable up here because we might need to talk to this guy. So I'm going to make a variable here called page view controller, right? And we'll set its type to UI page view controller with the exclamation point. So we're just telling Swift that, yeah, we're gonna initialize this variable when our view loads, right? Or when it initializes. So down here, I'm gonna say page view controller equals VC. And this is not gonna make Swift happy because view controller, or VC here, is a regular view controller, UI view controller. Oops, let me click it here with the option key. You can see it's a UI view controller, but it doesn't recognize it as a page view controller. So what I'm going to do, I know that it's a page view controller, so I'm going to say as UI page view controller, and now it'll cast it as this type, and that makes it okay for this variable, right? Because they're the same type now. Okay, so when you have a page view controller, the page view controller needs a delegate and a data source. So the data source supplies the pages that the page view controller is going to display, and the delegate handles events and things that might happen in the PageViewController, right? So if it does something or it needs some information, it'll ask the delegate for that, okay? Or if something happens, it'll pass that on to the delegate for the delegate to handle, okay? The data source, though, is going to provide the pages. So what we're going to do is we're going to say PageViewController dot data source equals self. So now ViewController will be the data source for the PageViewController. And then what we'll do is we'll say PageViewController dot delegate equals self. Okay? And we're going to get an error here because in order to be a PageViewController delegate and a PageViewController data source, we need to conform to that protocol. So up here, what we're going to do is we're going to add a comma, and we're going to say UIPageViewController data source, comma, UIPageViewController delegate. So I'll add these two protocols at the top, and then now Swift will be happy that we qualify as data source and delegate, but then it's going to give us an error here saying like, hey, you know what, you actually say you qualify as this, but you don't support the methods required for these two features, right? So what we need to do, and you can see that here if you click on the error, it says type ViewController does not conform to the protocol, right? So what we need to do is essentially these two, or actually it's really in our case it's the data source is requiring that we provide two methods that the PageViewController is going to talk to the data source with, right? It's going to talk to the data source and ask for the ViewController before and the ViewController after. So if you swipe, to the left, it wants the next ViewController, that's the ViewController after, and if you swipe to the right, it'll need to know the ViewController before the current ViewController, okay? So what we'll do is we will put a mark in here, mark PageViewController data source, okay? And the two methods that we need are I'll just start typing PageViewController, and then there's one here called ViewController after ViewController, and then another one called ViewController before ViewController, okay? So let's do before ViewController first. And this is a long method name, right? It's hard to see it on the screen here. I'll add a line return in here, right? So let's realize that when this method is called, it passes you a reference to the PageViewController, and then it also passes you the current ViewController. So this ViewController here is the ViewController that the PageViewController is displaying. Think of it as the current page, okay? So that's the current page, and then this method returns a UIViewController. It's actually an optional ViewController, right? So we don't have our ViewController set up yet, so what we'll do is just to quiet the error, we'll type in nil. So we can return a nil here because this is optional, okay? Now let's add the next method. So that was ViewController before ViewController, okay? So what we're going to do now is we're going to get ViewController after ViewController. So we'll get that method. I'll just start typing PageViewController, and then it'll give me all the methods for PageViewController, right? So here's PageViewController, and this method is identical to the other one, with the difference is that it wants the page, after, but it supplies the ViewController or the PageViewController. It gives you the current ViewController, and then you return, right? The little arrow there means return, right? So you're going to return the ViewController optional, right? So let's type in return nil for right now. Okay, so both of these methods here want a ViewController, and we need to supply it. And the ViewControllers that we have here, if I switch back to storyboard, they're these guys, right? So we already made them, and what we're going to do is we're going to create them from storyboard with their storyboard ID, right? So what we'll do is we'll make an array up here. We can make this a let because we're not going to change it. I'll call it pages, and then it will contain some strings, and the strings will be page 1 view controller. And now this has to be spelled exactly like the storyboard ID, right? So, make sure that you do that, right? So I'm going to call this one page 2 view controller. I'm checking my spelling too, right? And then we'll do page 3 view controller. And then I also have page 4. So let me type in page 4 view controller, right? So I'll just assume, I won't show all of this, right? But I'll assume that you will get the names correct here. Okay, so you need all of the names for, the name for each of your view controllers, okay? The storyboard ID, that is, right? So this has to match exactly what we have here in under the identity inspector under storyboard ID. So it's got to match this, right? So anyway, so there's our pages, right? Okay. And then I'm going to write a helper method here, okay? And this method will be called, it'll be a function, and it'll be called ViewController at index, okay? So the idea is that this method wants to return a view controller at the index of the pages array. So essentially it'll get the storyboard ID here at this index. If the index was 0, create that view controller from this ID using storyboard instantiate view controller with identifier, and then return that view controller. So the method here will receive the index, which is an int. Wait, that's not an int, that's an int, right? And then it will return a UI view controller. Okay? So what we'll do is we'll say if let's change this. Let's do this. Let's say let storyboard. No wait. Let how about let's do let VC equals storyboard dot instantiate view controller with identifier. And then the view controller that we want here is in the identifier that we want is in the array, and we're passing in the index. So we'll say pages, bracket, index, right? And now this might return an optional value, right? Because it might not return something because maybe storyboard doesn't exist, or maybe this thing doesn't exist in the array, or maybe there's no view controller with this identifier, so if we look here, you'll see it's got the question mark, right? So this is an optional item, right? So let's actually return that optional here. So I'm going to make this, return a view controller optional, right? And then we can just say return view controller now, right? And that'll satisfy this, right? Okay, because this is optional and we're returning an optional value, right? Okay, so we'll just have to know that when one of these methods up here, because both of these methods are going to do the same thing, they're going to want to do this, right? They just need to figure out what the index is, and they do that differently, right? So, or they're going to do it differently in a moment, right? So anyway, so there we go, right? So we've got this thing here. If we need a view controller, we can ask for a view controller from its index, right, or by its index, okay? So before we get into the page before and page after, let's go back down here to ViewDidLoad. And the thing is here, when we load up the PageViewController, it really needs a default page, or the first page. It needs to know what page we're starting with, and then it also maybe needs to know like how we want to do the transitions, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to call PageViewController dot set view controllers. Okay, so we'll say set view controllers, and you can see that view controllers is an array. It shows the square brackets there with the question mark, right? So it's an array. So we need to supply an array. And what I want to do is I want to get the first view controller, and I can use this view controller at index to do that. So I'll say view controller at index, and we'll just get the first one at index 0. And then we can use the, the exclamation point here, because I know that I have an item here at item 0, right? Okay. Or, you could set up an if then and kind of check that, right? But I'll just put the exclamation point in. So now we've got direction. So this is going to say, like, how are we going to navigate our UI PageViewController? And this has a couple, properties that you can choose. So you can choose forward, left, down, reverse, right. I'm just going to say left for now. Okay, so recognize let's do left, right? So I'll say direction left. Animated can be true, and then this completion says, like, if we animate the first view, what do you want to do when you're done animating that view? I'm going to just make that nil for now, because we don't really have anything that we need to do here. Okay. And then, of course, I got an error. It's probably a problem with this thing. Let's check it here. Oh, it doesn't have a left. I got the wrong thing there. I thought that looked funny. Let me undo that. I'm just going to undo back to this thing. And I'm going to put the dot here. Yeah, I thought it should be, left sounded kind of weird. Yeah, so I'm going to change this UIPageController direction forward. That kind of makes sense. And then actually you can shorten this. You don't even need this thing. So I'm going to shorten that. I think this looks correct to me. And then we'll do animated true, and completion can be nil. So I'll type that in again, right? And then I'm going to add one more line here. That's going to be PageViewController.didMove to parent view controller. Okay? And the idea here is saying, like, we want to notify the PageViewController that it's done moving to its parent, right? We just added it to a parent view, and just to tell it, like, okay, that process is finished and you are now in the parent. And then we can pass it the parent. So we'll say self, because we're the parent, right? We did self add child, so this must be the child, right? Okay, so I think that looks all right. Let's give it a quick test. So I'll click run here. And let's see what happens, right? Oh, and there we go. So now there's our PageViewController. Right now, since we are not supplying anything, or only nil for the page before and the page after, our PageViewController has a single page. So we can't really swipe to go to the next page, because there isn't a page that we're providing, right? But anyway, so this is working, right? So we've got the PageViewController, and we've set up the delegate and the data source. And then our PageViewController, we set the initial view controller here to be the first page, right? And then we notified the PageViewController that, it's in the view and ready to be viewed. Okay. So in the next video, maybe because this one's getting a little long, maybe I'll handle the pages in the next one here, right? So we'll finish it up in that. Okay. So thanks for watching, and I hope that is useful.